This is History 202, Presentation 2, Occupation, Corruption, and the End of Reconstruction. So what we're going to look at in this presentation, we left off the last presentation talking about the beginning of military or congressional Reconstruction. So we're going to focus on that, and we're going to carry it through 1877 and the end of the technical end of Reconstruction, if you want to look at a textbook version of it. But as I mentioned in the first presentation, Reconstruction carries on long beyond that, over 100 years later, and in some ways it's still ongoing. So. But this is, if you're going to look at a nice clean break, it'll be 1877. So that's where we're going to stop this particular presentation. So, the radical agenda. We talked about some of these radical Republicans, Benjamin Wade, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and there were many, many others, but those are some of the leading figures. So what was the radical agenda during this particular period of time? This is what they said in their own words. They said that Reconstruction was a righteous cause to forge a new union. Now think about that, a new union. They're recreating the United States. That's why I called the first presentation Reconstruction and Recreation. That's essentially what's happening here. It's not Reconstruction, it's recreation. We're getting an entirely new United States. To avenge the Union men who died in the war, to punish the South, to remake the South. So the idea was to remake what was there. And remember, Stevens said the South were conquered provinces. Charles Sumner said the South had resorted to territorial status. So these weren't states. Lincoln said they were states. Andrew Johnson said they were states during their Reconstruction plan. Republicans are saying these aren't states. They're conquered provinces. They're territories. Because if they're states, you have to treat them differently. At the same time, they're saying that these things aren't states. They're acting like they're states when they need them to be when we're talking about ratifying amendments to the Constitution. So, on one hand, you say they're not states. On the other hand, you say they are states. Which one are they? This creates a very messy constitutional issue and legal problem, which I think is never resolved. They never settle this issue. So this is a real mess, and it's going to create all kinds of problems. But what you have here is one party, one branch control of the government. This is the tyranny of the Republican Party. The president's powerless to stop them. The Supreme Court is powerless to stop them, even when it comes to federal legislation that's unconstitutional. You know, the idea that the Supreme Court can declare legislation unconstitutional was not settled fact, even in the founding period. Particularly when it came to state law. States were allowed to do whatever they wanted as long as they didn't violate Article 1, Section 10. And the Supreme Court, even if it declared a federal law unconstitutional, could not do that to state laws. And even then, it wasn't certain if the Supreme Court should do that. It was simply an appellate court. You appeal the decision. You say, well, this lower court followed the proper procedures, so the decision stands. It had nothing to do with the legality or the constitutionality of a law. They only took that on themselves. But in this particular period of time, the Supreme Court can't do anything. Nowadays, you see the Supreme Court is probably the most powerful branch of government, if not along with the executive branch. The Congress has taken a back seat. And that's not how the government was designed. Well, here, the Congress is taking a definite front seat. The President, the Supreme Court can't stop it. So you lose checks and balances. The idea is to have enough checks and balances so one branch of government doesn't dominate the others. But you really don't have that in this particular period of time. So, the Congress will pass in 1867 something called the First Reconstruction Act of 1867. All southern states except Tennessee were removed from the Union. This is interesting. They just fought a war for 4 years and said, you can't secede. You can't secede from the Union. It's illegal. You can't do it. So we fight a war to keep the Union together. That was what the war objective was in 1861. Ending slavery only became a war objective a little later, a couple of years into the war. Well, we're fighting the war to save the Union, so you can't secede. It's illegal. But now in 1867, the Congress is saying we can kick you out of the Union if we want. So on the first hand, the people of the states, through conventions, through their own action, through popular support, left the Union. Now the Congress, without the support of the states, is saying you're out of the Union. So if you fought a war for 4 years to say you have to stay in the Union, how can you kick them out of the Union? This is kind of silly. The remaining 10 states were divided into 5 military districts subject to martial law. So those states that were kicked out of the Union, removed from the Union, were then divided into 5 military districts subject to martial law. So now they've suspended civil courts. They've actually established martial law. The only time in the Constitution that you can do that is when a state, through the application of the legislature or the governor, are in a case of rebellion, and that's not the case here. There's no war. There's no rebellion. These states are in a time of peace. So can the Congress simply declare that there's a state of rebellion in an area and declare martial law? Well, no. The states have to do that, and the states have to ask the government if they need support. And none of that was done. So this, again, is blatantly unconstitutional, but they do it anyways. States were then forced to draw up new constitutions and ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, wait a second. In order to ratify an amendment, it takes 3/4 of the states to do so. 3/4 of the states. So what they have done now, remember the Republicans are saying these are conquered provinces, these are territories, you're not in the Union. So how can a state that's not a state ratify an amendment? You can't. So this is blatantly illegal. So this law, on the one hand, is hypocritical because it says that we're going to remove you from the Union when we just fought a war for 4 years and we had over 1 million men killed or wounded, saying that you can't leave the Union. Now you can leave the Union. We're saying you have to. Then you're saying you're going to be under martial law, which is illegal, and then we're going to make you ratify an amendment, which you can't do if you're not a state, which is illegal. So the Republicans are just trampling all over the Constitution here, and it doesn't matter because there's nothing there to stop them. Even if Johnson vetoed the bill, it's going to be overridden. The Supreme Court can't do anything about it because they're being emasculated by the Congress. This is a real mess. So none of this is legal, and this was pointed out several times, even into the 20th century, that the 14th Amendment was never legally ratified. But it doesn't matter because it's on the books. Now, the important thing to note here is why the Republicans were doing this. Again, remember back to the last presentation, and we looked at the black codes. This is going to be a rhetorical issue to damage the South. But most importantly, in the Freedmen's Bureau bill, the idea was to get former slaves voting because they needed those votes to win elections. If the Republicans don't win these elections, they lose control of the central government. And that's eventually going to happen in the 1880s. But it's going to take some time. So from about 1860, really from 1861 until about the early 1880s, Republicans are going to control the central government. And in that 20-year period, you're going to see a lot of legislation that's going to completely and dramatically alter the face of the United States in many ways, as I talked about in the first presentation. So there are the 5 military districts. You can see in this particular area we would be under District 3. Alabama, Georgia, and Florida under District 3. What you also see on this particular map is you have a date that's not in parentheses. The top date is the date the state was readmitted to the Union. So wait a second. Again, you're saying you can't leave the Union, but now we're kicking you out. Now we're readmitting you to the Union. So which one is it? Can the Congress kick a state out of the Union? There's no constitutional power to do so. The Congress can't do that. If you're saying that the people of the state can't leave the Union, then sure enough, the Congress can't kick a state out of the Union. This is where Reconstruction is complete hypocrisy. And then the bottom date is when the state was quote-unquote redeemed, and we'll talk about that. That's when the Democrats took power back in those particular states. And so we'll talk about the meaning of that in a few minutes. Now, Johnson, of course, is going to veto the first Reconstruction Act. It doesn't matter. Congress overrides his veto and then forces him to send 20,000 troops to the South to enforce the law. Many of these troops are black soldiers. And in a particular period of time in the United States when race relations were pretty tense, this is seen as an affront to white Southerners. So it creates a very volatile situation. The other thing that's going to happen, of course, is that registered black voters are now outnumber registered white voters. There were 627,000 registered white voters in the South and 703,000 registered black voters. All of the black voters, I think to a man, you probably find a few exceptions here and there, are going to vote for the Republicans. All the white voters are not going to vote for the Democrats. Some of these registered white voters are going to vote Republican. So what the Republicans have done is created perpetual control, Republican control of the South. This is going to be violently resisted in certain ways, and we'll talk about that in the next presentation. But the idea was to maintain political control of the South, to not let the control that was there before the war began reassert itself. So if you can do that, you can continue to remake or recreate the Union. In 1868, the Congress will pass something called the Omnibus Act of 1868. Military Reconstruction required the use of the Army to maintain Republican control of the South. Without it, the Republicans would have lost power because they were controlling the ballot. And 3 states were actually under military control until 1866 and 1877. 1876 and 1877, excuse me. 7 former Confederate states were allowed back in the Union after following the provisions of the first Reconstruction Act, and this was due to the presence of the military and the disfranchisement of white voters. So the military, through the ballot box, first of all, a lot of white voters can't vote, but then the military would intimidate people when they went to vote. In the 1860s, you didn't have a secret ballot like you have today. You had to openly vote for a particular candidate or set of candidates. And maybe you were intimidated through the military there. Maybe they would try to make you take an oath of allegiance. Maybe they would force you to vote one particular way, or said that, stuffed ballot boxes, whatever the case may be. The idea was through voter fraud and voter intimidation to keep certain elements in power. Georgia would be placed back under military reconstruction after it ignored provisions of the 14th Amendment and removed blacks from the state legislature. So this was considered reoccupation to white Georgians. So Georgia did what they were told, and they were allowed to operate as a state. And then so the federal government says, well, you know what, you just violated the 14th Amendment in our mind, so you're going to be placed back under military reconstruction. This is a very tense time in the South. And the fact is that there was a lot of animosity between the Republican Party and white Southerners in particular. And you're going to see a lot of violence because of it. Now, Johnson, of course, had been working against the Republicans for quite some time, vetoing legislation, trying to thwart their every move. And so the Republicans wanted him out of office. They started planning for this almost immediately after it was clear that he wasn't going to be following along with their designs for Reconstruction. So the Republicans set 2 traps for him. They wanted to impeach him. And they passed 2 pieces of legislation. The first is the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. The second is the General of the Army Act in 1867. The Tenure of Office Act made it illegal for Johnson to remove cabinet members without congressional approval. Now, the president had long been able to do this since the time of George Washington. And it's not in the Constitution that the president has to have the approval, advice, and consent of the Senate to appoint ministers, consuls, cabinet members, but not their approval to remove them. But the Congress is saying now they have to have their approval to remove them. The General of the Army Act did the exact same thing. The President as Commander-in-Chief can always appoint subordinate officers, and he had done that since the time of George Washington. But now the Congress is saying if you want to remove the General of the Army, the top general officer in the Army, you have to have our approval. So this is a violation of the constitutional authority of the President, and they aren't constitutional. Neither one of these pieces of legislation is constitutional. And they all knew that Johnson would eventually violate and break one of these laws, and he does. In 1868, Johnson will remove the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, from his position. He was a non-Republican spy in the cabinet, a holdover from the Lincoln administration, and he was one of the most vindictive men in the cabinet. He really hated the South. At first, it was seen that Stanton was a Democrat, actually, and it was thought that Stanton was going to be fairly sympathetic to the South and fairly moderate in his dealing with the War Department. But it became clear when he became Secretary of War that he had no love for the South, and there was willful mistreatment of Southern prisoners of war during the war, coming straight down from the top. He had done things like replace Southern ministers with Northern ministers in Southern churches as the Union Army moved through. He was very heavy-handed in dealing with dissenters in the North during the war. And so Johnson got rid of this guy. Well, because of that, he violates the Tenure of Office Act because he did it without congressional approval, and then he would be impeached by the House of Representatives. So let me explain how impeachment works. A president can be impeached but not removed from office because the House of Representatives will vote on impeachment. At that point, you have to have a trial in the Senate, and you have to be convicted by 2/3 of the Senate of violating a crime. So there have been 2 presidents impeached in American history. The first is Andrew Johnson. The second is Bill Clinton, neither one of whom was removed from office. So impeachment doesn't get rid of you. It just says that you are impeached, we're going to hold a trial because you're abusing your power, and if you're convicted, you're gone. Now this was seen in the founding generation as a way to get rid of abusive presidents, if they're violating their oath of office, if they're not enforcing the Constitution, not adhering to the Constitution, doing things that are obnoxious, or high crimes and misdemeanors was a wide variety of things. but neither one of these men were convicted. Now, the Supreme Court presides over the trial, and Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase is presiding. And the prosecution would argue that Johnson broke the law and acted in a manner unbefitting of the president for simply vetoing legislation. I mean, that was his main crime. Well, he vetoed legislation. He's blocking all, our programs here. He's not doing things that we tell him to do. He's not executing legislation like we want him to do, and he violates the Tenure of Office Act, so therefore the guy broke the law. Well, the Democrats in the Senate see this thing for what it is, which is a witch hunt, and several Republicans realize that this is simply just a political move to get rid of the president. And so even though the majority of the Senate wants Johnson out, they get 35 votes for removal and only 19 against, that 19 was one vote enough to block a two-thirds majority, and so Johnson will stay in office. But really becomes a lame duck president at this point. He can't do anything. He already can't do anything, but now he's seen as completely inept, and nobody really pays attention much to what Andrew Johnson says or does anymore. It's really interesting, in fact, in 1926, the Supreme Court ruled that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional in the case of Myers versus the United States. So here we are, several years later, about 60 years later, the Supreme Court is finally saying that, Johnson was actually impeached for breaking a law that was unconstitutional in the first place, so he should have never been impeached to begin with. Now, the other part of military reconstruction is constitutional reconstruction. So there are changes in the Constitution through the amendment process. Congress is going to reduce the power of the Supreme Court. This is not unconstitutional, but it was irregular. And there is a discussion of doing this now because so many people are upset with the Supreme Court on both sides of the aisle when they do things that they don't like. So the Congress can remove court jurisdiction over certain issues, but this is irregular. It usually doesn't happen. However, we are going to get 3 amendments to the Constitution. These are called the Civil War amendments. The first were ratified in December of 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. So slavery actually existed in the North, theoretically, and in some cases did, until December of 1865, 8 months after the war was over. So we'll talk about this in the next presentation when we look at civil rights in this particular era. In 1866, Congress, at the insistence of Salmon P. Chase, reduced the number of Supreme Court justices from 10 to 7. This limited the presidential appointment powers. So Chase, the Chief Justice, thought that this needed to be done. But Congress can do this. They can set the number of judges, so we go from 10 to 7. It would be increased back to 9 in 1869 after the election of a Republican president, U.S. Grant. So the fear was that Johnson would appoint several Democrats at the Supreme Court and therefore undo Reconstruction. That's a really interesting situation. And once Grant comes back in, the Congress says, okay, we got a Republican back in, so we're going to increase this back to 9, let him appoint a couple of justices, and therefore everything's good in the world. In 1870, the 15th Amendment allowed all men, regardless of race, the privilege of voting. So now you have the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which expands the suffrage. Not women. Women still can't vote, but all men can vote regardless of race. What's really interesting, though, in 1866, before all the hubbubaloo with Andrew Johnson, you had the Supreme Court actually working against one element of the Republican-controlled Congress, and that was through a Supreme Court decision labeled Ex parte Milligan. Now, this was not actually in the Supreme Court itself, but when the federal judges, the Supreme Court judges, were what's called riding the circuit. They actually go out and serve in the circuit courts. This was a circuit court decision. The decision said that martial law and military courts were illegal as long as civil courts were in operation. So essentially what happens here is the Supreme Court, or Supreme Court Justice Chase, says, you know what, this military reconstruction is illegal because we have civil courts in the South. What the Congress was trying to do, or what they said was, well, if we go through these civil courts in the South, we're never going to get what we want because they're controlled by Southerners. So we're going to send these issues to federal court, and then they'll side with us. But the Supreme Court, while they're riding the circuit, Chase says while he's riding the circuit, well, you can't do that. That's illegal. Just because you're not going to get the decision you want doesn't mean you can manipulate the system. So what Congress does, which they're allowed to do, they just remove court jurisdiction over such matters. They just pull it away from them and say you can't decide on these issues. So they're allowed to do that. Congress can do that, which curtails the power of the court quite substantially. And then, of course, we have the 14th Amendment, which I already alluded to in the beginning of this particular presentation. In 1868, former Confederate states were required to ratify the amendment to re-enter the Union. So again, how can a state that's not a state ratify an amendment? They can't. That's illegal. What this thing did was give former slave citizenship of the United States, but not individual states. It's a very important component of this. A lot of people today consider the 14th Amendment as something that grants people citizenship of states as well, but no. And the states still had control of citizenship requirements, and because of that, theoretically, they could still control voting and other things. And the 14th Amendment is often seen as a way to incorporate the Bill of Rights. That was not the design of the 14th Amendment. This was later on made, the Supreme Court decided that's what the 14th Amendment did. But the intent itself was very clear at the beginning. This was not an incorporation amendment. This was simply designed to give former slaves citizenship of the United States. But again, it didn't incorporate the Bill of Rights. Every state still had its own Bill of Rights. So if you were a citizen of the state, first and foremost, you had to follow the legal process of that particular state. And you can be a citizen of the United States and not a citizen of the state. So that's an important distinction to make. I mean, if you're living overseas, you're a citizen of the United States, but you're not a citizen of any particular state, theoretically. So the states could still control citizenship. This did strike down the black codes and prohibited former high-ranking Confederate officials from holding office or voting. The question is the legal ratification of it. No one really questions the intent of the amendment. The question is, was it legally ratified? And several states said no. In fact, the issue is very interesting. You need 20 states for ratification, and 28 states for ratification. And 2 states, after the first Reconstruction Act was passed, would rescind the ratification, Ohio and New Jersey. They would say, no, we're not ratifying this thing, because now you're doing something illegal. You can't force a state that's not a state to ratify an amendment. So leaving the total at 26. Now, technically, 16 states of the 37 did not legally ratify the document. And so we really didn't have the 28 states needed for ratification. Secretary of State William H. Seward, though, was forced to promulgate the amendment regardless of the decisions of New Jersey and Ohio. So the Congress actually forced them to say, well, the amendment's legally ratified. And but it never was. So this is really a congressional abuse of power. The 14th Amendment was not legally ratified in 1868. And so this has created all kinds of problems, and Congress is abusing its authority here. Now, 1868 was also a presidential election year. The Republicans will nominate Ulysses S. Grant of Ohio. He was the hero of the war for the North. And in 1868, they're going to engage in something called the Bloody Shirt Campaign. What they do is they take a shirt from a Union veteran that's been wounded or killed, or maybe not even at all, and they'll just put some blood on it, and they'll put it on a pole and wave it around and say, if you vote for the Republicans, you're voting for the guy that wore this shirt. If you're voting for the Democrats, you're voting for the guy that shot this guy. So they're going to use emotion. This is a motive response to an election cycle. The issues aren't important in that particular case. It's just, hey, we support these Republicans because they support us. And the Democrats are the bad guys. You see this throughout American elections, even within the last, say, decade. Back in 2004, it was often portrayed that if you supported the Republican Party, you supported the war on terror. If you supported the Democrats, you supported the terrorists. And so this was kind of used that way in that particular time. This is not new, and it was used quite extensively here in 1868. The Democrats would nominate Horatio Seymour, who was at one time the governor of New York. Grant would win in a very narrow election because of the sizable Union veteran vote and the black vote in the South. Really, in 1868, the Democrats should have won the presidency. But there was a tremendous amount of voter fraud. Soldiers were voting 3 and 4 times. Soldiers were being brought in to vote in not their own state. This was crazy. And, of course, then you had all the disfranchised whites in the South, so they couldn't vote. So the Democrats probably should have won. You can see that Grant will get about 300,000 more popular votes. But the Democrats probably should have won in Alabama and Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and of course Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia couldn't vote in this particular election, so their electoral votes don't count. So Grant, I mean, it looks like a huge electoral college victory, but it probably should have been a lot closer than it was. So Ulysses S. Grant will become the 18th president of the United States. He actually was the youngest president in history of the United States to this point. He was the hero of Appomattox, won the war for the Union. Grant was actually, though, a Democrat in his youth, and he really wasn't supportive of the Republican Party, even when the war began. When we get to the 1872 election, his opponent in 1872 brought up this story that Grant, apparently in 1861, when the war was just breaking out, Grant had told a number of people, and this was reported, that he had said he would never fight to free the slaves, and if that ever became a war aim, he would resign his commission. And so now here you have Grant presiding over the government, the federal government, the executive branch, and having to enforce Reconstruction policy. And this was brought out as, this guy is never really a fan of ending slavery to begin with. He wasn't really a fan of Reconstruction, so you can't really trust this guy. A lot of people would say this quote is bogus, but I think that there's probably some merit to it. The man who was circulating this was a newspaperman, and he generally had pretty good sources. He was not acclimated to politics, really. He preferred the military. You make decisions and people follow them. And so what Grant really liked to do, though, was drink and smoke cigars. Or not really smoke cigars, he liked to chew cigars. And in fact, it's reported he chewed about 100 a day. Eventually, he would die of throat cancer. And the thing about Grant is generally his administration is seen as very scandalous. But with the exception of military reconstruction, he's not really involved in any of these scandals, though they are going to mar his presidency. So some of the major issues we're going to talk about are corruption and scandal at the state and federal level. We'll look at the end of Reconstruction, home rule for the South, and the Indian Wars, which we'll talk about in a later presentation, Presentation 5, in fact. Now, let's talk about some of the scandals. The first is something called the Gould-Fisk scandal that took place in 1869. It was masterminded by a man named Jay Gould, who we'll talk about in the presentation on the Gilded Age. Now, Jay Gould was considered the most unscrupulous member of the wealthy elite, and he had insider information. And apparently, what happened was he tried to corner the gold market. He had insider information from one of Grant's confidants that the central government would not be selling gold. And so what Gould is going to try to do is corner the market, buy up a tremendous amount of gold, and essentially inflate the price and control it. But what happens is there was no assurance made. And so when the general government sells off some of its gold reserves in 1869, gold prices will plunge, and Grant will be blamed for it. It leads to a depression called Black Friday of 1869. So here you have, this is indicative of the Republican Party. You've got people buying influence, very wealthy individuals. They have insider information, and they're corrupt, and they force an economic catastrophe. Now, Gould is not ruined by this, but a lot of the other individuals who invested with him were. And so this is a real economic mess for some of the elites in America at the time. Then you have something called the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Credit Mobilier Company was charged with building the Transcontinental Railroad, at least a portion of it. And they were receiving government subsidies. And they were doing things like, instead of building a straight line, they would put curves in it because they were paid by the mile of track that they produced. And so they were doing all kinds of crazy things out there to get more money. And at the same time, the Credit Mobilier Company was involved in bribing legislatures for these subsidies. And they will receive stock. This was graft. So essentially, these people are voting themselves money. And this involved even the executive branch. Schuyler Colfax, who was the vice president of the United States, was involved in this. So was future President James Garfield. He denied his involvement, said, "I'm innocent of this." But he was involved with this thing, and there were 30 men involved, 28 other men involved besides these guys, and they were all Republican congressmen. And the idea was that they were going to get rich by voting themselves money. This is extremely illegal, extremely corrupt, but it's going on because this is what you're getting in the Reconstruction period, tremendous government corruption. The crime of 73 had to do with something called the Coinage Act of 1873. What essentially happens here is that the government in 1873 will pass a law placing the government on the central government on a gold standard, so they will demonetize silver. So they take silver out of circulation. So now the only medium of exchange is gold. Well, what this is going to do is create some deflation because you will actually have a contraction of the money supply. Well, that hurts debtors, and it hurts minors, and it hurts people that it hurts debtors, because let's say you borrowed $1,000 and you had a certain income. Well, when they take money out of supply, your income will actually go down, but that debt hasn't gone down. So the people that were getting rich off of this were New York bankers primarily. This is going to hurt some people, and there was a general consensus that perhaps the best monetary policy is a bimetallism standard, but you have to let the market set the rates. This is getting into complete, crazy, very difficult to understand at times economic information, but the government will go into a gold standard. This will be a big issue in the 19th century. Should we keep it on a gold standard? Should we do bimetallism? What should we have silver as a medium of exchange? What should we do? But of course, Grant, because he's president, is going to be blamed for the poor economy. Grant really had nothing to do with this other than signing the bill into law. This was really the work of the Congress and some of the influence in the banking industry in the Congress. Banking and Congress, finance and commerce get in bed together, and that creates all kinds of problems. Now, 1872 is an election year. Grant is opposed by Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was really a Republican, but he's running on the Democratic ticket. Greeley had long been a reformer, had long been an advocate, never was really a Democrat at all, but he didn't think that Grant was doing a very good job. And there were some people who were starting to break from the radical agenda. They thought it was going too far, and Greeley was one of those individuals. So essentially what happens is that Grant is going to win, but one of the reasons why he wins is because Greeley will die before the election even takes place. So there's no other candidate. I mean, Grant really runs unopposed, but when I show you the next map, you can really get a feel for the fact that there were still a lot of people out there. Even though Grant didn't have an opponent, they still weren't going to vote for him. So Reconstruction will continue after Grant wins the election. So, I mean, look at that. He gets 81% of the total Electoral College vote, but it was a little closer in the popular vote, 700,000 votes, but there were still people getting votes. There were people determined never to vote for Grant no matter what. It didn't matter if Horace Greeley was dead. They'd rather vote for a dead guy. You can see that Greeley actually got 3 Electoral College votes in Georgia, even though he's dead. I mean, you're voting for a dead guy. Now, let's talk about the South a little bit. The South was under the control of 2 types of people in this particular period of time: carpetbaggers and scalawags. A carpetbagger, by definition, is a northerner who settled in the South after the war looking for political gain and economic profit. Many of these people were Union Army veterans. They had gone to the South and stayed after the war. And this was a popular political cartoon at the time. You can see that the White House there is called the Halls of Justice, but it's being controlled, or the State Houses as well, controlled by the military. And Grant is the guy riding in the carpetbag, and of course the South, the woman there, the solid South, is having to carry this massive carpetbag under very sharp stones with bare feet. So the South is under the heel of the federal government and is controlled by the Army. Bayonet rule. So without the South being burdened by this carpetbagger and the military, things would have been a little better. And you can see it's rule or ruin. The South really had no choice in this matter, but they're going to suffer severely. It was seen at the time through these Union soldiers who came down and simply just, again, white Southerners can't vote. They're getting the former slave vote, and they're doing whatever they want. They're running roughshod over the South. A scalawag was a Southerner who supported the Republican Party in Reconstruction after the war, and the most famous scalawags, these people were actually lower than carpetbaggers. The most famous scalawag was James Longstreet. Longstreet was a former general of the Confederate Army. In fact, during the end of the war, Lee's right-hand man, Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. So he becomes a Republican and supports Reconstruction. I mean, this was seen as lower than dirt. These people were just considered to be the bane of society. Nobody wanted to associate with these people. Now, James Longstreet did this. He was friends with Grant, actually, and he did this because, in his mind, he's going to try to control Reconstruction policy. But what he's doing is alienating his own people. And so Longstreet is very much a vilified figure in the South after the war. Now, what about state corruption? Well, scalawags dominated the Reconstruction governments of Alabama and South Carolina. There were prominent scalawags in Mississippi and Louisiana. And carpetbaggers were elected to the United States Congress from various southern states. Many supported the economic diversification of the South, and we'll talk about that in Presentation 4. They also supported public school systems, particularly for former slaves. But all the Reconstruction governments were accused of excessive spending, corruption, voter suppression for white Southerners, and I've given you some examples of this. The state debt of Alabama tripled during the Reconstruction period, so they're spending money like crazy. Florida property values decreased 45% during Reconstruction. The state debt of Georgia almost tripled in one 4-year stretch during Reconstruction. Property taxes would skyrocket in both North and South Carolina, and this is seen as a way to confiscate plantations. So you raise the property taxes on people, they can't pay them, so you evict them, and then you come in and buy their property. Louisiana state debt increased over 5-fold with little to show for it. So the governments are spending money like drunken sailors, but yet at the same time there's nothing to show for it. So this was seen as tremendously corrupt and nasty, and state government was just as corrupt, it was thought, as the central government, if not worse. And this brings us to what's often called the Bourbon Redemption. So eventually, as I showed you on that map before, you had that date in parentheses, eventually the Southern Democrats would gain control again of the state governments. Now, it's not called the Bourbon Redemption because these people like to drink bourbon. They did. But the thing was, you had in France, after the Napoleonic era, the return of the old aristocratic control of France, and they were called the Bourbon family, and that's why this is called the Bourbon Redemption. You have the old families, many of the old families come back into power in the South, and they start controlling the governments again. And this took place at various times in various states. From 1870 to 1877, you're going to have this redemption period. In fact, it occurred in Alabama around 1874 when George Houston became governor. It took place in Georgia around 1872 when James Smith from Columbus, Georgia, became governor of Georgia. So it depends on what state you're talking about as to when the redemption took place. And again, here you have a map showing the different time periods. If you'll notice, though, on this particular map that Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina are still under military occupation, still have not been redeemed until 1876 or 1877, Mississippi too. But the two most important states would be Florida and South Carolina in this particular process. And that brings us to the 1876 presidential election. The Democrats will nominate Samuel Tilden of New York. He ran an anti-Reconstruction platform. And the South believes they have a shot to win the election. They should have probably won in 1868. They had really no chance in 72 because Greeley was a Republican. They didn't support him. But Tilden's considered a very good candidate, and he's running an anti-Reconstruction platform, and they think they can win. The Republicans will nominate Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. And Hayes also essentially runs an anti-Reconstruction platform. He's not in favor of it anymore. But this is going to be a very close election. In fact, there are disputed election returns in two states. South Carolina, disputed election returns in three states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. But essentially what you have is one set of election returns saying the Republicans have won those states, the other says the Democrats have won those states. Just so happens those are the three states under military Reconstruction. And so these states will actually give the votes to Hayes. Well, there's talk of war at this point again. Tilden is hot. The Democrats are hot. They're saying we can't even win an election. The Republicans are going to steal even though we legitimately won the election, the Republicans are going to continue to steal elections from us. There's no hope. So there's talk of secession again and outright war. And you can see how close it was. Tilden actually won the popular vote in 1876, but he loses the Electoral College vote by one vote. So if South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana went for Tilden, he wins the presidency. He probably should have won. But what's going to happen is rather interesting. One historian has called this the Compromise of 1877. It's probably a stretch to think there was much of a compromise here. Essentially what happens is that Hayes, there's a committee set up in the Congress to deal with this, and the committee decides that Hayes would be elected president without Southern resistance under the following conditions. The troops would come out of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. You would get one Southern Democrat to the cabinet, and that Southern Democrat would eventually be David Key of Tennessee as Postmaster General. You would get support for Southern industrialization. You would get a Southern Transcontinental Railroad. Well, 1 and 2 will be accomplished, as I said before, but 3 and 4 never happened, though Northern money poured into parts of the South, and J.P. Morgan would help finance the Southern Railway. But Hayes had already suggested an end to Reconstruction during the campaign. The thing, though, that also swung this election was Colorado. If Colorado had never been admitted as a state, the Republicans wouldn't have won this election. So even though you have a situation where it's so close, I mean, take those 3 electoral college votes away from Hayes for Colorado, and Tilden wins the election anyways, regardless of South Carolina, Florida, or Louisiana. And so it's really, Colorado's admitted to the Union. The Democrats actually did have some power in Congress at this point. They could have blocked that from happening, but they let it go through just before the election. So in some ways they did this to themselves. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes will be the 19th President of the United States. He serves 1 term. And some of the issues that we'll talk about, removal of federal troops and the end of Reconstruction, that happens. We'll look at some of the economics of the day in a later presentation, and also the Indian Wars in a later presentation. So Hayes is one of these kind of forgotten men in American political history, and we'll go into more detail on his presidency next time. So look for that, and we'll get into that in one of the later presentations. All right.